Structuring content within the body is probably the most difficult part of authoring HTML. In fact, you could give the same mock-up to 5 different designers and get back 5 different document structures. That's because in many cases, the structure that you use is entirely up to you. So let's take a look at adding some basic structure to our content. And as we do that, we're going to discuss a few of the best practices for determining document structure. So I have the structure.htm file open from the 02_05 directory. It's really just picking up where we left off. You'll notice that we have inside the body a couple of lines of text that really are placeholders for more robust content. When you look at a mock-up of a page or the contents of a page that are given to you as an author and you need to create them, one of the things that you need to think about is structuring the document and how to do that. And there's really a lot that goes into it. One of the first things that you need to think about is how is this going to be maintainable? What are the logical groupings of the content? Is this stuff all grouped together? If it does, is it a page header? Is it a sidebar? Is it something else? And you don't necessarily have to use those conventions, but those conventions have been around for a very, very long time. And they're well used within HTML authoring. And there are a lot of user agents out there that can do specific things based upon, how you've organized your content. So using sort of a structure that people have used before isn't necessarily a bad thing. And so typically pages will have a header that goes up top. They'll have a footer that goes in the bottom. They'll have content in the middle of that. And that content could be split up into several columns. Those columns could have names like content or main content, sidebar, aside. It really just depends on kind of how you want to organize it. Once you determine sort of that basic structure, you really also need to think about what's going on the rest of your site. One page might be structured one way, and then when you get to another page, the content of that page might not necessarily fit into the same structure you've given the last page. And you want your structure to be flexible so that you really don't have to have a unique structure for each page in your site. So you also want to look at the overall site as a whole and really look for some common structural elements that you can repeat across the entire site just to make life a little bit easier for you when you're authoring pages and then editing them a little bit later on. For what we've got, we have a header, we have a main content, a related content, and then we have a page footer. The most common element in HTML for structuring pages in terms of sectioning pages into different sections of content is the div tag, and that's the one we're going to be using here. Directly after the body tag, right here for the page header, I'm going to wrap this in a div tag. So the first thing I'm going to do is create a new line, and I'm just going to type in an opening div tag. And then I'm going to go to the end of that content, and then I'm going to close the div tag. And I'm going to do that for each one of these lines of content that sort of represent larger section of content. Now, if I was authoring this page from scratch, I wouldn't put the content on the page first. I'd put these divs on the page first. And again, it goes back to making sure that you're building the most simple structure first and then following that simple structure with more complex structures. It's going to help you author the page faster, and it's going to help you be more precise with your code. Right now, it's a little underwhelming. Yes, now we've sectioned all of these different areas off. We have the page header in its own div tag and so forth and so on. You'll notice again, we have an opening and we have a closing div tag. You also may be wondering, do they have to be on their own line? No, they don't. This would be just fine if I were to put the opening and closing div tag and the line on the same line. The only reason I'm doing this really is for readability's sake. It's a little easier for everybody to read when they see this on the screen. So now what has this actually done for us? Well, if I save this page and I preview this in one of our browsers, you can see that it doesn't really do much. So the div tag is a tag that really doesn't have any default rendering. It has no default formatting within a browser at all. The only thing it really serves to do is section content. Later on with styles, with CSS, you can make div tags do certain things. You can place them in certain areas. You can give them backgrounds, borders. You can give them specific formatting that only applies to that particular div tag and its content. So they're very helpful from a styling standpoint, but really what we're using them for in HTML, and there's a very important distinction here, is in dividing the content up into sections. So that's very important. Now, one thing that we would like to do is to go ahead and be able to identify these in some way. Give them some means of identifying one div as being different from another or having some type of semantic value. One of the easiest and best ways to do that with the div tag is to use one of two attributes. We have two attributes that we could use here to do this. We could use either an ID or a class. So I'm going to go up to the very first div tag, and I'm going to create a little bit of space after the div characters. And let's start out with using a class attribute. So I'm just going to use a class, Inside the value of that class, I'm going to type in header. I'm going to go down to the next div tag, and this time use an ID, and the ID that I'm going to use here is going to be main content, all one word, and I'm going to use camel case naming, which is lowercase first word, uppercase second word. What's the difference between a class and an ID? An ID is a unique identifier for that page, meaning I can only use the ID main content once on the page. So they're unique. They're for very unique areas of content that you won't be repeating throughout the page. You may have multiple headers, for example, on the page. You might have a header inside of a different section and then the main header for the page, that sort of thing. Here's the rule of thumb. If you're going to use an attribute more than once on the page, use a class. If you're only going to use it once, if it's unique on the page, then use an ID. Another reason to use an ID would be JavaScript can find elements that have IDs applied to them and do certain things with them. JavaScript can now identify classes as too, so that's not as big a thing, but a lot of Ajax widgets and other widgets out there will use IDs to identify an element. They're also used as fragment identifiers, which we'll see that a little bit later on when we create links. As a matter of fact, all these are unique for this particular page, so I'm going to go back up and I'm going to convert that div tag class to an ID as well. I'm going to go ahead and create IDs for the rest of these. So for just below the main content, I'm going to use the ID of sidebar. And finally, down at the bottom, I'm also going to use an ID of footer. So now not only do we have distinct sections of content on the page that we could then start adding, more robust content into, those sections are now identified in terms of what they are. Notice that we've used words that represent the meaning. This is the header, this is the main content, this is a sidebar, this is a footer. Now, HTML5 actually introduced a few new elements that we could use in these cases. For example, there actually is a header element. So instead of using div ID equals header, I could replace this with a header element. Now, I'd have to replace the closing tag as well, but I just kind of want to show you what these elements look like. I'm going to undo that. So we have different type of semantic elements in HTML5. We have header, we have aside, which we would be using here in case of the sidebar. We have article or section, which we'd probably use for main content, one of those two. And we also have footer as well. So those elements were brought in to sort of replace doing this. However, this is still the most common way, using div tags and then combining them with IDs and classes is still the most common way of structuring interior content on the page and sectioning that content off. The HTML5 tags are not widely supported in older browsers, especially the older versions of Internet Explorer, so you have to kind of use a little bit of JavaScript to add support for them. Most browsers really don't do anything differently with them. They represent them the same way that you would represent a div, and they give you the same type of styling. So really the only thing that changes there is how the outline of the document is created. So if you want to learn more about that, go out to the HTML5 specification and learn about how those new structural elements are changing how documents are outlined. There's very valuable information, but it goes a little deeper into it than we're going to be going to in this course. So there you go. We've now created our basic HTML document. Now, there's not much to it right now, but focus on this fact. This is all you really need in terms of creating a valid HTML file. A lot of people like to make things more complicated than they need to be. This is all we really need: an opening and a closing HTML tag, a head of the document, and a body of the document, and we need the content inside those sections formatted in the proper way. Now, later on, we're going to move on to learning more about formatting and structuring your document's content. But before we do that, I encourage you guys to go ahead and take a look at the optional lab at the end of this chapter that follows this movie, and that'll help you reinforce the things that you've learned so far.